Thank you, Jennifer. She's been one of my mentors in helping me to reach out to wider audiences through my writing. So I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank the Japan Society for sponsoring this. So let me get right into the topic here. This is from the cover of the book, and you'll see that it's from a screen painting done roughly in the, it's thought to be around the 16th century. And if you look very close, there's no title to the screen, there's no name, but anyone who is familiar with Japanese culture and this nature, particularly its cultural vocabulary, will notice a few things here. This is a close-up. You see the cherry blossoms around and at the center here is yamabuki. These are kind of mountain rose, it's translated as mountain rose, yellow caria. And it's right next, you see a stream, and it's very rocky on the edges. So for someone who understands, who's visually educated, this immediately signals Yoshino, and which is a mountain outside of Kyoto, the capital, actually outside of Nara. Now, the image here, the yamabuki, the cherry blossoms tell you it's spring. The yamabuki, the yellow flowers there, tell you that it's not only spring, but it's late spring. So this is how codified the images are, that this is a place, a famous place, and it's late spring, and it's deep in the mountains. So when I started this book, for many, many years, I had wondered why it was that the seasons were so important. Why did they appear in painting, poetry, so many different genres and media? Where did this come from? And why did it occur? And in what ways were it manifested? And I was also, as kind of a cultural historian, interested in how this thing, this phenomenon evolved and how it was different depending on the community. And I was particularly interested in the relationship to poetry, 31-syllable waka, classical poetry. What was the relationship of poetry to this culture, what I call culture of the four seasons? When I started my project, I was influenced by what was called eco-criticism, which is a field kind of methodology in literature, but applies, I think, very broadly. And it analyzes the way in which literature and other media represent the human relation to nature at particular points in history. What values are assigned to nature and why? And how do they shape our views of the environment? So I had asked these questions, and the answer, the most immediate answer, were in high school textbooks. So here's a standard, this is a guide to teachers of Japanese literature in high schools. Number one, Japan is an agricultural country. The Japanese are agricultural people. Since agriculture is controlled by the seasons and climate, since the climate in Japan is warm and mild, Japan is characterized by the leisurely change of the seasons. It's kind of hard to stop laughing in some parts. Particularly the next line. In contrast to Westerners who fight with and conquer nature, this is a topos that keeps reappearing, the Japanese live in harmony with nature and desire to become one with it. And this is idea that the Japanese are one with nature and appears in also in the 50s and 60s, American beat poets thought that this was one way in which Japanese literature was unique. Literature that is born from such climatic conditions emphasize unity with nature. But what's the reality? So this is kind of a summary of it. The standard view was mild climate, gentle topography, agriculture, and all these led to harmony with nature. The reality is that we have severe monsoon seasons, hurricanes, annual flooding, almost unbearable summers. The gentle topography, really quite the opposite. Earthquake zone, volcanic mountainous terrain. Only a percentage of the archipelago is actually inhabitable. And in terms of the agricultural country, it's true that rice agriculture was a key development, but it's also true that it led to the destruction of wild nature. And I give just one example. This is from the 17th century. It kind of gives a view of the mountains surrounding villages. And it's what's called the Hagayama, or bald mountain phenomenon, which the mountains have been stripped of the forest, and it created a natural disaster throughout the entire country. And this was a gradual result of massive cutting of trees for temples, statues, and so forth. Japan uses more wood than most cultures. So, why the stress on nature? And this is one of the main thesis ideas of the book, that it actually begins with urbanization and retreat from wild nature, and the construction in the city, in the metropole, of what I called secondary nature, nijiteki na shizen, which replaces primary nature with highly aestheticized versions of nature. These are kind of cultural surrogates for primary nature, garden, painting, poetry, and so forth. So I'm going to show how this construction emerged. This is from the Tale of Genji, perhaps the most famous work of Japanese literature. It grew out of the capital in Kyoto. And if we look at the female names of the character, the female character names, Kiritsubo, Fujitsubo, Murasaki, the heroine, we see almost all the names coming from plants or flowers. And this is as a result of the influence of poetry. These are all images that are nurtured in the poetic tradition and then picked up in the tale. I give you one example. This is from the Tale of Genji Scrolls, 12th century, about a century after the writing, and it actually includes our earliest extant manuscript. And it gives a very good view of the relationship between the interior, as a result of what's called a convention, fukinuki yatai, the blown-off roof. So we always see nature and the human condition side by side. And to the left here, we see an autumn wild autumn field with Suzuki pampas grass, bush clover, and other things. On the right-hand side, Murasaki, the heroine, is dying, and that's Genji right there, mourning the imminent death of his beloved one. And this scene actually turns around a series of poems. This is by Murasaki herself. So briefly residue upon the bush clover, even now it scatters in the wind. And this is a form of dialogue, and the dew refers to herself and about to be blown off by the autumn wind. She's the evanescence of the dew and of her own life. So this is a very good example of how nature and the secondary nature and the interior drama and human drama are always side by side. So this is another screen from the Tale of Genji Scrolls. Gives some examples of what I refer to as secondary nature. That is to say, on the left here we have one of the ladies in waiting looking at a scroll, at a manuscript illustration, someone reading. And we see nature in the hanging screens and the sliding doors. And right outside here is the garden. So we have a variety of media, textual, cultivated gardens, meisho, which are kind of famous places, often based on poetry, ikebana, bonsai, and so forth, tea. Visual representations, painting, architecture, and dress, and in performative arts. Today I can only show you some of these in the book. I go into more detail. Okay, so when did this start? The earliest examples are from the Manjyoshu, the collection of Japanese poetry from early 8th century, where the poems are all organized by the seasons in the progression of the seasons. And they're composed, and this is important, in this Tempyo period, which is 8th century, after the establishment of the first major capital in Nara. And it's symbolic because it's with this establishment of the capital that we have the development of this secondary nature in terms of the capital being cherry blossoms, willows were planted along the streets. All the aristocrats had gardens, and so forth. We have the beginning of painting, development of poetry. Okay, but let's think a little bit about the actual climate, as we suggested. Actually, long summers and long winters, relatively short spring and autumn. And climatologists actually think that Japan has 5 seasons, summer being Tsuyu, the monsoon season, and Tsuyuaku, which is post-monsoon. So that makes for a very long season. However, in poetry and in the visual culture, spring and autumn are the ideals. These are the dominant seasons, with almost very little attention to summer and winter. The Kokinshu, the first imperial anthology of classical poetry in the early 10th century, these are the numbers of poems in each of the seasons, and you can see that spring and autumn are dominant, overwhelming. So actually, the Kokinshu is very influential in kind of setting the cultural foundation for many media and for views of nature in the seasons. So we actually have an inversion of the actual climate with spring and autumn as the ideals. The poetic essence of summer is the summer night, the coolest time of day, and the dominant image of winter is snow, but in the poetry they look like cherry blossoms. So here in the poetry we have the Kokinshu, this first anthology, representing almost a wish fulfillment of summer is cool and winter as spring. It's like looking forward. That's not to say that spring and autumn remained the only major seasons. Part of the book talks about the historical evolution. By the medieval period in the 13th century, winter becomes extremely important, and a whole winter aesthetic develops around ice, snow, and so forth. I can't go into that and have to move forward. Okay, so what are some of the forces here to create this kind of elegant seasonal culture? Here it says, Fujiwara Teika, one influential waka poets in the medieval period in the 13th century, says poetry is a style of the country of harmony, wakoku. And this wa and ka are used to designate classical poetry, the poetry of Yamato, but also the poetry of peace. And here he says, poetry should compose in gentle and emotionally moving fashion, no matter how frightening a thing may be when one writes about it in Japanese poetry, it must sound graceful and elegant. And there's a kind of debate about whether a wild boar should be described in poetry or not, and the answer is basically no. Okay, so what are the major seasonal motifs in Kokinshu? And this kind of creates the building blocks, kind of the basic codes that will then be used in painting and other genres. And I just listed the most prominent one: plum blossoms, warbler, cherry blossom, Yamabuki wisteria, Hototogi small cuckoo. This is a white flower. Crimson leaves, bush clover, pampas grass, and then winter again is very small. It's snow and water fog. Now, what are the characteristics of those particular plant or animal motifs? First of all, it's almost always on the flower, and the tree, particularly with color, stressing color and scent, it's only birds and insects that cry, that sing. And the only animal is the deer, which was thought to give a mournful cry. That's to say, it sang in a way. Atmospheric phenomena are very important. The high humidity creates, there are like 5 or 6 different words for shower, and harusame, and so forth. Cosmology, the seasons come from the mountains and then from the high and come down to the ground and the rivers. One of the most important things is the phases, and particularly the stress on the beginning and end. The first and last phase almost isn't. And there's a strict progression. So you start with plum, go to cherry blossom, and then again go to the yamabuki. It's never reversed. In this way, people know which phase of the season it is. Established associations, deer and loneliness, it's part of this fusion landscape and motion. And then set combinations. These are also extremely important. We'll see those in just a second. And stress again, as Teika said, on elegance and harmony. So this is a typical from ukiyo-e, bush warbler, uguisu, and red plum. And we know from this particular combination from the red blossom, it has to be the first phase of spring. So not only spring, but early spring. And the bush warbler kind of giving us the first sounds of spring. This is a yellow carrier that we saw in the Weber screen. So again, this is spring, but we know it's late spring. And it comes in a particular set with frogs, which were thought to sing in a river stream underneath the yellow carrier, Yamabuki. By the 13th century, Teika had created this list in which he matched flowers with birds by the season. So this is, and then this became one of the main models for painting. In fact, he did this for painters. So here's a typical example. It's from in the Met exhibit. The Japan Society and Met are simultaneously doing a Rinpa exhibit. It's in the Met exhibit right now, and we see here. Excuse me. We see here the small cuckoo and the white deutzia flowers indicates the 4th month, beginning of summer, and then there's a poem to remind us of that particular connection. Kenzan did a lot of ceramics in which he used this kind of. Okay, going on to other media, dress was extremely important in the Heian period in the time of Tale of Genji. And you see here the multiple layers of sleeves here. And the color combinations in the sleeves were extremely important. And we have here color combinations, actually with this white surface and red interior. That indicates it's a crimson plum. And we have the same flowers and plants that we saw in the Kokinshu, in the poetry, in a very specific order. Crimson first, cherry blossoms, yellow carrier. Wisteria is kind of transition between late spring and summer. So this is the color combination for Yamabuki or yellow carrier. This gets, in the Heian period, they did not wear design robes, but from the Edo period, from the 17th century onward, this is a typical sode, worn as kind of a haute couture. And we have yamabuki, the waves, the motifs. We have the yamabuki themselves, and we have what's called chirashigaki, in which there's a poem that's inscribed right onto, part of the poem inscribed right onto the dress. And this is the poem reflecting the light at the bottom of the Tama River at Ide, so clear that the yamabuki flowers lie in layers. So the water's reflecting the yamabuki that we saw in that frog poem, making it a kind of double vision. Now there's another, so that was one aspect of nature as embodied in the classical poetic tradition that spread out through the various media. This is another very important aspect of nature, and what we see here is a crane, pines, and the rising sun. And these are all what I call talismanic. That's to say, it's some kind of amulet, it's a charm to avert evil. If you give a present with these things, it will protect the recipient. So here we have immortality in the crane, longevity in the pines, and then the rising sun is also talismanic. Okay, and we see the plants in the Goseku, which is the these are the most important annual observances from really the 7th century, 8th century onward. And they're actually derived from Chinese custom. You see the lucky days, they're 3, 3, 5, 5, 7, 7, 9, 9. And they still exist today, of course, New Year's, Hinamatsuri, Dolls Festival, and so forth. And each of them is associated with a particular plant or fruit, which has a particular talismanic value. Here's ukiyo-e from the 3rd of the 3rd month, and we have peach blossoms here. And peach was associated with immortality, particularly the dew on the peach. So that's a typical sekku, or 7 sacred festivals. So the function of the plants in these annual observances, one is revitalization of life. So, for example, New Year's, as you know, is a major annual observance. New herbs, these are to give you new life, new energy. Longevity and mortality, pine, peach, chrysanthemum. Chrysanthemum, of course, is imperial crest. And also to ward off disease and evil. So, if we put the two types of natural representation that I've been talking about side by side, we get two types. One is the seasonal, and we see chrysanthemums autumn, but it can be trans-seasonal. So when you see a painting, you need to know which one of these is it. It's possible that it's both, but usually it's one or the other. So plum is spring, but if it's a plum branch, particularly in the snow, it suggests endurance. The crane is a waterfowl, therefore winter, but it can also be longevity, as in the painting that we saw earlier. The right-hand side tends to be of Chinese origin, whereas the left side tends to be native Japanese associations. Okay, this is in the exhibition upstairs. And it looks, at first glance, it looks rather odd that there's this man standing between cranes and deers. But he's Jurojin, god of longevity, originally a kind of Taoist figure from China, and he becomes one of the gods of 7 fortunes. So we look back here, we see that longevity in the crane, in the figure, and in the deer, which were often signs of coming or gods. Okay, so I wanted to show some I'm going to be showing some examples from the exhibit upstairs. We can also have talismanic landscapes. Just give a quick. This is a Heian residence, and you see this island here in the lake. The island in the lake, referred to as Nakajima, was thought to be eternal land in the sea. That's where the gods descended. So that it has kind of a symbolic value. Hodai is a land of immortals. Sandy Cove, where you have multiple sand pebbles and also kind of winding. And then the four seasons in four directions. So here's an example from a lacquer incense container. We have the island in the sea. It's also Hodai. We have cranes, pines, and then we have this the sandy beach, which suggests a myriad, unending. The national anthem, which actually comes from a classical poem, is also talismanic. It has to do with the pebbles and suggesting immortality. Okay, another aspect that's very important understanding the seasons is the directions. This Chinese belief in fusui, or had winter in the north, autumn in the west, spring in the east, and summer in the south. This is for every residence, but it was also for the capital. So we have this in Kyoto, and we see here, the example that I'm going to take is Tatsuta River, which is immediately to the west of the capital. This ceramic Nabeshima ware has no title, but we know immediately that it's Tatsuta River, and it's autumn. Okay, and we encounter this, the four seasons in four directions, increasingly as time evolves. Here in the tale of Genji, at the very climax of the tale, Genji brings together all the most important women and puts them in one residence, and they occupy four different quarters, which are four different seasons, and you can see that they are in the same order that we saw with the capital, and the most important ones are spring and autumn, with Murasaki, his great love, and Aki Konomu, who connects him to power. So we see here two basic seasonal paradigms. On the one hand, we have this constant motion of the seasons forever evolving, also attention to the kind of detail, the dew falling off of the bush clover, the sense of impermanence, but at the same time we have the four seasons in the four directions moving in the opposite direction, kind of utopian time. In one of the paintings upstairs, Sakai Hoitsu, Rising Sun with Plants of the Four Seasons. And at first, it may seem puzzling, but that's spring, with cherry blossoms, Kakitsumata, that's iris, it's summer. This is a little hard to see. It's lilies, and there's snow on the leaves. It's winter and autumn. And then again, the talismanic sun. So we have the seasons in four directions. I see that the winter is not exactly where it should be. Okay, another very important aspect of the seasons is a social function. I took this from a Japanese business handbook. With the internet and email, There's less of this, but the formal letter should start like this, with reference to the season and have, in this particular case, feeling impatient for the arrival. So it mentions plum blossoms and impatience for the arrival of spring. Now, this is the same function that you find in both poetry, in haiku, the 17-syllable poetic form, and in other forms such as flower arrangement. So let me just give you one example here. About 60% of Basho, of course, is the most famous haiku poet in Japan. About 60% of his poems are actually social greetings. They're greetings to the host or hostess, to friends, and they commemorate the occasion and also praise the hostess. Here, gazing intently at white chrysanthemums, not a speck of dust, Basho has come to the house of one of his women disciples, and the white chrysanthemum, a seasonal word for autumn, represents the hostess, and that in here implies that she's elegant, the house is spotless, and very beautiful. So it's a homage to both the hostess and the residents. So the function of the seasonal word, which is required in the haiku, marks the time and place. It's a greeting, shows respect, gratitude to the addressee. And it's also a sign of elegance, that you have some cultivation, and of course it draws on your cultural vocabulary of the seasons. The next one that I'm going to show, Rikka, this is one of the early stages, historical stages of Ikebana. This is an example of a flower arrangement. In fact, there are no flowers here. It's just leaves. The cultural roots of Ikebana, number one, it's placed in the alcove, so it's kind of like an altar display space. And there are two very important roots, historical roots. One is the Buddhist offering, so you offer flowers to the Buddha or the Buddhist statue. Also, when women such as Murasaki Shikibu wrote poems, they usually attached a flower to the letter. The paper was very important, the poetry is important, the calligraphy was important. Also, usually attached something seasonal to that beautiful paper. And so that was another aspect, one of the origins of Ikebana. And then this developed into an art form and became very popular from the 15th century and in the early modern period. This is an example from one of the earliest examples of kind of Ikebana. And we see that this is the alcove, it's a very big one. There's Hitomaro, he's the god of poetry, and we see the two scrolls here, nature, and then the beginnings of Ikebana. And this is a poet, this is a waka meeting. They're composing poetry together. So the flower arrangement, which is a vastly understudied traditional art form with very important treatises, poets were very involved with this. It had many of the same functions that we saw with poetry. It created a miniature landscape within the residence. That miniature kind of recreation of nature, of course, in bonsai and other forms, marks seasonal time. It's a greeting, again, mark of elegance, and it has a talismanic function. And this is from just a little quote from one of the many treatises on flower arrangement. Flower arranged for every single social occasion. Since this is a medieval period, still a period of battle and warriors, going off to battle was a very important occasion. But when you did so, you should not use camellia, maple, azalea, other plants whose flowers or leaves scatter easily. because that would have been very unlucky for the young soldier. Flowers for a new dwelling, important, but should not include anything that is red, which suggests fire. So you can see that there's a very elaborate encoded vocabulary intended to pay homage to the guest. Now we take a leap and move to outside the capital, outside of the kind of elegant four seasons that I've been talking about, to what I refer to as the Satoyama, or farm village. Here we see the rice cultivation. There's usually a river, a village right at the foothills here, and then a typical small mountain. The cosmology of the farm villages which start to emerge, well, the recorded documentation is from around 12th and 13th century onwards. And the literature that kind of emerges out of this environment, they're done, the literature is mainly by Buddhist priests who have aristocratic education, but they're observing farm villages and farm culture. And the cosmology is very different from what we found in the Imperial Waka anthologies. First of all, we have kind of familiar animals in the village. And then in the foothills, we have the fox. Tanuki is one of the most popular in kind of folk literature, folk culture. None of these appear in Japanese classical poetry. So we have this really, although these are become more and more prominent, and then further as we move up the mountain, we get demons and various supernatural beings that communicate with the gods or have access to the heavens. This is a typical, this is from the early Edo period, and we have a tanuki, we have a raccoon, and a rabbit, and it's a very famous folk story. And you see the Satoyama, you can see that the mountains, small mountains in the back. Okay, so the result of kind of these two environments, cultural environments, developing side by side by the medieval period, is that we have, on the left-hand side, we have those insects and animals and birds that sang. And then on the right-hand side, those are not known for their singing, but they belong to the Satoyama. And there's a very different view of them. They're pests, prey, related agriculture, whereas on the left-hand side, they are aesthetic objects. One of the few plants that actually appears in both is the Suzuki or pampas grass, which is very important in farm culture, but was also important in Japanese poetry. But for the most part, these are very different. Okay, so we have on the one hand this elegant, highly encoded nature, emphasis on color, scent, sound, harmony, and then on the other we have the Satoyama, nature's bounty, nature's natural disaster. Religion plays an important role here. Nature is worshipped and also feared. And we have animals and plants appearing as gods or demons. And we have domestic plants and animals. Now, for those who are familiar with Japanese literature, depending on the genre, it will be reflecting a very different world. So with the Tale of Genji, it's going to be waka-based nature. We don't see any raccoons. There is a cat as a pet, and some sounds of dogs, but otherwise it's a waka-based nature. Whereas the anecdotal literature from the medieval period and from the warrior tales reflects this, such as the Tales of the Heike, reflect this farm-based cosmology. The interesting thing is that by the late medieval period, in the 15th, 16th century, we start to get this fusion of these two different types of nature. So those who are familiar with No Kyogen, the performative arts, you'll see rabbits and other plants from the Satoyama coming onto the stage. And so these are examples from late medieval where there's a kind of a focusing in on animals from the Satoyama kind of merging here. They're acting like aristocrats. So literally this fusion of high and low. Or nature could be seen as dangerous. This is an earth spider. And these are the skeletons of those that the earth spider has demolished. Okay, so by the Edo period, in the 1600s, we have these two parallel spheres, cultural spheres, starting to intersect. And in this early modern period, we have them side by side, and actually they appear in a pyramid. And this is taken from, these are seasonal words that are used in haiku. At the peak of that pyramid, seasonal pyramid, we have the cherry blossoms, the Hototogisu moon here is strictly autumn, bright leaves for autumn and snow. So we actually have the 4 seasons right at the peak here. The second layer is also from classical poetry, spring rain, returning geese, orange blossoms, and so forth. What's new here with haiku, which was a popular, actually it's referred to as haikai or linked verse, you had to have a seasonal word in the opening verse, and you had to know the seasonal words in order to move from one verse to another, to link from one verse to another. In this very wide popular vase, and these are actually about 40 to 50 classical topics at the top. The wide base literally in the thousands. And I just took some examples from spring, kind of lowly plants or flowers like dandelion, garlic, horseradish, and cat's love, which was the squealing of the female as it's chased by the male, was kind of a humorous seasonal topic, in fact, very popular. Haiku poets in the Edo period had a choice. They could play with these new seasonal words, or they could work with the ones at the top from the classical tradition, or they could combine these in kind of playful ways. Because there were thousands of seasonal words, and they were constantly categorizing, and they would have great debates about which season this belonged in. They had to have a handbook. This is a modern seasonal handbook. It's about that thick and has close to 6,000 to 7,000 seasonal words. So the seasons had grown in such number that some guide was necessary. And so haiku poets usually will carry around a kind of digest, small version, and this is for home use. Okay, so what happens, so in the modern period, one of the critical kind of shocks that came to the system was that at the beginning of the Meiji period, they moved to the Gregorian calendar, shifting from the lunar calendar. So all of the seasonal associations we've been talking about were based on the lunar calendar. And the difference between the lunar calendar and the Gregorian calendar, you have to subtract about 5 or 6 weeks from the solar calendar or the Gregorian calendar to get the lunar calendar. So it's almost a gap of over a month in most cases. The other thing that the government did, because the new calendar screwed up the annual observances, they abandoned the Goseku as being official annual observances. And so this really created a dilemma for the poets, the haiku poets, who wanted to follow the tradition. Most of them wanted to follow the traditional associations, but I mean, what would they do with the new calendar? This is an example of what happened. Tanabata, which this is actually from Japan Society webpage. The Tanabata, of course, is one of the most important annual observances, particularly for young women. Occurs on the 7th of the 7th month, that lucky number, and there are 7 items. The number 7 is extremely important. So it had been in autumn. The 7th, 8th, and 9th months were autumn in the lunar calendar, the traditional calendar. But now, with the shift to the Gregorian calendar, Tanabata, there was this great debate, but they decided they would move it to the 7th day from the lunar calendar to July 7th. That's the 7th month in the Gregorian calendar. So Tanabata went from autumn to summer, and that's how it's celebrated today in Japan. That was in order to keep the 7-7, which was the lucky numbers. You couldn't do away with the lucky numbers. But what would you do with the autumnal associations that had developed for thousands of years? So most haiku poets, not all, but most, decided to stick with the Tanabata as the autumnal topic. So there's kind of this cultural schizophrenia as a result of the new Western calendar. Another movement that occurred was under the old lunar calendar. The New Year's was the same as the beginning of spring. This is very important. In fact, the most important phase of any season was the first phase of spring, because it not only marked the beginning of kind of new life, but it marked the beginning of the new year. So we had the first 7 days are just packed with all kinds of different kinds of annual observances, and many of them kind of talismanic. But with the new Western Gregorian calendar, the New Year split off from spring. So New Year's was now in the middle of winter. It was no longer spring. So in the Saijiki, these are the seasonal almanacs for poets. There are 5 volumes because there were so many seasonal words for New Year's, and they could no longer be housed together with spring. So as you can see here, there was a gradual kind of growth of seasonal topics, seasonal words in the Kokenshu in the High Heian period. Maybe as I said, there are about 40 to 60 very important ones. By the time we got to the Edo period, literally thousands, particularly in the bottom level. The other thing about seasonal words is that they originally were used for nature, what we think of birds, plants, or for seasonal observances, which were also related to nature, such as the peach and chrysanthemum. But in the Edo period, in the early modern period, the seasonal words kind of expanded to cover almost all aspects of human existence, from food to fashion to work. In fact, food became one of the most important seasonal words for haiku poets. And food, of course, is a very important seasonal aspect of the culture. I give you one example here, which is, as you can see here, cold beer. And as you know, those who are familiar with Japan and go there frequently, beer is drunk all year round. So it's like the deer. The deer exists all the time. But with the seasonalization and codification, it became a summer word because the new social drive or entertainment of drinking cold beer on the tops of department stores and various bars in the summer, in the hot summer. And so other things like baseball, that's a summer kilo, yachting, short sleeve, sunglasses, these are all seasonal words for summer. Okay, so this pretty much brings me to the end. Just a few words of summary here. It's true that climate and topography are important, but I think the more important thing that I was trying to convey here in the book is the cultural construction, and that it came with the move to the city and developed in the metropolis. And it created a sense of harmony where substituting for the chaos, the actual chaos of the actual environment outside the capital, even outside the residence. And as we saw, it exists in many different forms. And of all the forms of secondary nature, poetry, particularly Waka classical poetry, had the most influence. This became kind of the working vocabulary for educated aristocrats, then for educated samurai, and then educated commoners. And painters, people doing flower arrangement, talking, they all use waka as kind of this common vocabulary. So it was kind of this provided a base. With time, this kind of vocabulary spread to every level of society. Through, for example, in the pleasure quarters in the Edo period, this is very important to know all your seasonal codifications. And by the time of the Meiji period, that had come to be regarded as a national trait. As we've seen, it was highly encoded, and often really an inversion or escape from the actual environment. I think the other aspect that's important here is the Satoyama. The scholars, Japanese scholars that I've studied, very few of them mention the Satoyama, this alternative view of nature, which I think is extremely important in understanding kind of the multiplicity and kind of the interaction between what we might call the high tradition and a more popular tradition that comes together beginning in the late medieval period. One last thing, number 14 here, construction meisho. These are famous places. So one of the famous places in the very opening slide was Yoshino. But what happened was that particularly in the Edo period from the 17th century on, there was a profusion of these famous places. And they took from the top of the seasonal pyramid and created parks, temple gardens, so forth, using one of the seasonal motifs from the top of the pyramid. So it's here. This is a typical example. Today, Ueno is known for its cherry blossoms and drunken revelry during the cherry blossom season. But this is the result of horticulture, not kind of natural union with nature. The other thing is that the surrogate nature was so highly developed that it actually hid some of the more complex problems with the dealing with nature, particularly extensive destruction of the natural environment. Thank you very much.